All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with the anterior thigh video. These are going to be muscles of the anterior thigh that we're going to talk about. So first thing, I want to go through these bony landmarks that we have over here, and then we'll talk about the muscles in isolation. So we're going to start off with this innominate bone. This may be a lot of review for people that have seen my previous videos on the innominate bone or on any muscle areas that is near the pelvis. So if you feel like you want to skip over this part, go ahead. But if you haven't seen those, stay tuned. So these are a lot of important landmarks that we have on the pelvis that you should know. So first of all, we're going to start off with this point that's back here. Okay, so remember, actually let's start off with this. Remember that this right here, right, this whole crest on the superior margin of the ilium, this is known as the iliac crest. Okay, that's your iliac crest. And remember that the iliac crest is going to terminate anteriorly into a spine. It's also going to terminate posteriorly into a spine. So this spine that it terminates into posteriorly over here, this is called the posterior superior iliac spine. Okay. There's a posterior superior iliac spine. Likewise, directly inferior to that, you see another projection of bone right there. This is going to be your posterior inferior iliac spine. Okay? Your posterior inferior iliac spine. And we're going to have the same pattern happening on the anterior side for those anterior spines. Okay? Yeah, you see I'm fiddling over here with this little arrow thing. Okay, so on the anterior side, we have the same pattern. So we're going to have anterior superior iliac spine. Okay, that's this little projection of bone right there. And then we're also going to have the anterior inferior iliac spine. Okay, anterior inferior iliac spine. Nice. All right, so then after that, what we're going to have is this other spine right down there, okay, that's projecting posteriorly. And that is a spine that is located on a bone known as the ischium. Remember that this innominate bone is actually three bones that fuse together during embryogenesis. And so we categorize them as such: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So this is the ischium back there, and that specific spine is known as the ischial spine. Okay. Then we're going to have this notch that is created between the ischial spine and the posterior inferior iliac spine. That notch right there is called the sciatic, I should be more specific, the greater sciatic notch. Okay, the greater sciatic notch. Then let's look at the rest of this innominate bone. So we're going to have the pubic tubercle, which is this projection of bone right there. So pubic tubercle. Okay. Then we're going to have this part right up here, right? So this whole thing is known as the body of the pubis. Okay. And so this up here is going to be the superior pubic ramus. Superior pubic ramus. Okay, and then we're going to have an inferior pubic ramus. Okay, inferior pubic ramus. If you want to know more information about this innominate bone in detail, I have a completely separate video that I'm going to link right here on just the innominate bone, and it goes into detail so you can know those landmarks cold. All right, so then we have this foramen right here. This is the obturator foramen. Okay. It transmits the obturator nerve into the medial compartment of the thigh to control all those hip adductors. Now let's move on to the femur. So we have over here this part of the femur right there that's fitting into the acetabulum of the innominate bone, right? So the acetabulum is the socket of the hip joint, and the femoral head is the ball that fits into that socket. Okay, so we have the femoral head. The femoral head is going to be that round ball right there, and then directly inferior to it right there, we're going to have the femoral neck, right? And let me see if I could just put this up right there. All right. And then we have these two trochanters of the femur. The one that's on the lateral side, the larger one, that's going to be our greater trochanter. And then this one right here is going to be our lesser trochanter. Okay. Then we're going to have the shaft, right? I'm just going to call it the femoral shaft. You could also call it the shaft of the femur. All right. And then we look at the distal part of the femur. And what we're going to see is that the femur as one of the long bones is going to terminate into two condyles distally. Okay. We have one condyle that is on the medial side, one condyle on the lateral side. Okay. So we have the lateral condyle. Okay. And then we're going to have the medial condyle. Okay. And now notice that directly superior to the medial condyle, I labeled this little bony bump right here. Okay. That is an attachment site for a muscle we're going to see later called the adductor magnus. And so this is called the adductor tubercle. Okay. The adductor tubercle. Then we have this little floating sesamoid bone right here anterior to the knee joint. And that is the well-known patella. Then we're going to have, if we look distal to the patella, we're going to see now on the tibia, okay, on the proximal portion of the tibia, we see this rough patch right here, this little rough patch that's kind of shaded. Okay, that's a tuberosity, and that's a tuberosity where all the quadriceps muscles are going to insert there. Okay, it's not called the quadriceps tuberosity. It's named after the bone that it's on. So it's called a tibial tuberosity. Okay, the tibial tuberosity. Then if we look over here, directly lateral, kind of lateral and superior to that, there's going to, this part of the bone that I labeled over here. You can't really tell too much from this drawing, but it's like a little tubercle that'll or little rough patch that's there. You'll see it on an actual real bone model. Okay, and that's going to serve as an attachment site for a huge band that runs on the lateral side of the thigh. Runners will be very familiar with this band. It's called the IT band. Okay, so the IT band is going to insert itself onto this point right here. This is known as, well, colloquially is known as the Gerdy's tubercle. Gerdy's tubercle. Okay, I didn't mean colloquially. I meant something else. I forgot what was the other term that I meant. It's basically the term that you use whenever you name something over after a person. An eponym. I believe that's what it is, an eponym. Okay, so then we have over here, remember that the leg is going to be composed of two bones in a similar fashion how the forearm is. So we have the tibia, and then we also have the fibula, right? The fibula. And so this part of the fibula that is articulating with the tibia right here, okay? This is known as the fibular head. Fibular head. And we're going to see that there's a muscle that we're going to see that there's muscles that attach to that fibular head. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the fibular neck, and that's the last thing, right? The fibular neck is the part directly inferior to where the head is. All right, straightforward. Okay, straightforward. If you need to go over this a couple of times to stick it in your brain, go ahead. Or you could go ahead and purchase the workbook and just do it yourself by hand. You could do that too. You know, the link is in the description below. All right, Vastus Lateralis. Vastus Lateralis. Okay, now we're going to start talking about the quadriceps muscles. All right, so I put this over here just so you can realize that the Vastus Intermedius would be in place. Okay, and we're going to see the Vastus Intermedius later. But attachment sites for the Vastus Lateralis, we're going to have the linea aspera. Okay, so we're going to have the linea aspera, which is, if you've seen some of my previous videos on the posterior thigh, you would know that this is a rough line that is running down the posterior aspect of the femoral shaft. Okay, so we can't see that from this view, and that's why this arrow is curved to delineate the fact that it is behind this bone, right, outside of our view. So the Vastus Lateralis, right, is attaching on the posterior aspect of that femur, but then the whole muscle belly basically wraps around the femur and runs distally to insert itself onto this tibial tuberosity. Okay, so what is that going to look like? That's going to look like this. Okay, that's going to look like that. Next, we're going to talk about the Vastus Medialis. So Vastus Medialis does the same exact thing. It just does it on the other side. It does it on the medial side. Okay, so it's also attaching to the linea aspera and then inserts itself onto the tibial tuberosity, and that's going to look like that. Okay. Next, we have the vastus intermedius. The vastus intermedius is going to attach to the anterior shaft of the femur and then runs distally to also insert onto the tibial tuberosity, like so. Okay, so we have right there, there's 3 out of the 4 quadriceps muscles that we just covered. Here's going to be the last and final one. The last and final one is the rectus femoris. The rectus femoris is attaching to the anterior inferior iliac spine right here. Okay, it is the only muscle that attaches to the anterior inferior iliac spine. Okay, you're going to see other muscles that attach here to the superior iliac spine, but rectus femoris is the only one that will attach to the anterior inferior iliac spine, and then it will run distally to attach to the tibial tuberosity along with all of the other quadriceps muscles. Okay, and so the important thing to point out here is the fact that, so this is the last quadricep in place, right? This is the 4th one this is the 4th out of the 4. Okay, so notice how all of the quadriceps muscles, all 4 of them, cross the knee joint. Okay, they all cross anterior to the knee joint. And so when they pull on this tibial tuberosity, they're going to pull the tibia anteriorly and superiorly to go into extension. So the action that's created by the quadriceps is extension at the knee joint. Okay, this is just kicking your leg out straight. Now, another thing I want to point out is the fact that the rectus femoris is the only one out of the 4 quadriceps that, in addition to crossing the knee joint, it also crosses the hip joint. Crosses anterior to the hip joint. So because of that, the rectus femoris is also capable of producing or assisting with flexion of the hip. Okay, it's not the main hip flexor. We saw the main hip flexor in the previous video with the iliopsoas. That's the main hip flexor, but this is an assistant to that hip flexion. Okay, the rectus femoris is the only muscle out of the quadriceps that does hip flexion in addition to knee extension along with all the other quadriceps. Okay, I think I drove that point home. All right, next we're going to talk about Sartorius. All right, Sartorius. Yeah, so Sartorius is an interesting muscle. So it attaches to the anterior superior iliac spine, and then it goes down to attach to the pes anserinus. And if you've seen my previous videos on the posterior thigh or the medial thigh, you will know that the pes anserinus is an attachment site for one muscle out of each of the 3 compartments of the thigh. So there's going to be one muscle of the anterior thigh that attaches to the pes anserinus, a second muscle in the medial thigh that attaches to the pes anserinus, and a third muscle in the posterior compartment of the thigh that also attaches to the pes anserinus. So we have 3 separate muscles that each originate in a different compartment of the thigh, but they will all come together to insert onto the tibia at an area that's known as the pes anserinus. And if we break this term down into Latin, pes means foot and anserine is referring to goose. So it's the goose's foot, because these 3 strap muscles basically form what's likened to a goose's foot with its 3 little webby toes. Okay, so what is that going to look like? That's going to look something like this. Okay, it's going to look like this. Sorry that it keeps on moving that way. All right, so Sartorius is going to look like this. It basically straps all the way across like so to insert onto that pes anserinus. Okay, and then when we look on this on a full cadaveric specimen, the Sartorius is essentially going to serve as the roof of a space in the thigh known as the adductor canal. Okay, but that is something that we'll save for a different video. All right, now next one we have is the tensor fascia latae. The tensor fascia latae is a very important muscle. Okay, the tensor fascia latae is inserting onto the iliac crest, but specifically it's inserting onto the anterior portion of the iliac crest. Okay, it's attaching to the anterior portion of the iliac crest just right here. And then the distal insertion site is Gerdy's tubercle. Now remember, in the beginning of this video, I said that Gerdy's tubercle is the insertion site for the iliotibial band, right? Realize that the tensor fascia latae is the muscle that gives rise to the iliotibial band. Okay, it gives rise to that iliotibial band. Or I should say it's a muscle that has a lot of the muscle fibers have a broad major insertion onto the iliotibial band, because the iliotibial band per se is a thickening of the fascia lata. And the fascia lata is the fascia that wraps around all these muscles on the thigh, okay? So the tensor fascia lata, what does it do? It puts tension on the fascia lata, okay? It also assists with external rotation of the hip. And one thing that I want to say about the tensor fascia lata that I put it in this video because this gives us a good visualization of it. But what I would say is that I wouldn't necessarily mentally categorize the tensor fascia lata along with the rest of these anterior thigh muscles. Why do I say that? Because I like to categorize things based on innervations a lot of times, right? And we're going to have some future videos that talk more about nerve and artery flow. But what I want to leave you with now is that all of these muscles in the anterior thigh that we just covered, except the tensor fascia lata, all these other muscles that we covered are innervated by the femoral nerve. So the femoral nerve effectively controls the whole entire anterior thigh, okay? The tensor fascia lata is innervated by the superior gluteal nerve. So it's not innervated by the femoral nerve along with the rest of these anterior thigh muscles, okay? And so that is the end for this video. Gross anatomy is one of the most difficult subjects in the world. Luckily, it doesn't have to be. Anatomy is one of those subjects that needs constant verbal and visual repetition in order to get good at. What better way to reinforce this information than with the scientifically validated method of drawing? Neuroscience has shown us that we retain information better when we physically draw it out. That is why the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy Workbook is designed to walk you through all the layers of the musculoskeletal system, allowing you to draw the muscles into place. This is excellent for reinforcing muscle attachments, bony landmarks, muscle names, and actions. This will save you tons of time from mind-numbing tactics such as repetitive flashcards or passively listening to boring lectures. With this strategy, you can actually begin to enjoy studying again and have a much better way to retrieve the information. Order a copy of the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy today at the link below so you can spend less time being stressed and more time being blessed.